what happens is that the 1,000 years has passed, and as the 1,000 years has passed, then what happens is Satan will be released. And as we look at this, I think in a lot of cases, people take a look at this, and there's a tremendous amount of confusion as to why. Why in the world would it be that Satan would be released? And I think that for us, again, we come back to the fact continually that Revelation is written not to satisfy people's curiosity, not to take and say, okay, so what we're going to do is provide a chronology or a timeline or anything like that. But Revelation is a profoundly pastoral book. And by pastoral, I mean that God is shepherding the hearts of his people. And as he's shepherding the hearts of his people, he's speaking to people who are facing particular difficulties and challenges and persecution. And he's also giving clarity and understanding as to reality in all of its depth. Because when we think about what it means that this is the revelation or the apocalypse or apocalypso, what we're talking about here is the fact that God is literally apocalypso means the pulling back of the curtain. So God is pulling back the curtain on reality, because what we see is something of a shadow of reality. We think that the stuff that we can see and touch and pound on and know is there, that this is reality. In a lot of ways, we are, even as believers, we're closet materialists. And I mean materialists not in the sense of the pursuit of riches necessarily, but in the sense of the fact that the material is the world that we live and think in. And so we tend to be materialists as philosophers in our understanding of the world. And this pulling back of the curtain is saying, what is really real? What is true? What is going on beyond the curtain? And beyond the curtain, we understand the fact of the spiritual battle. And beyond the curtain, we understand stuff about the human heart. We have stuff explained to us about the human heart. And when we see Satan unbound and returning after 1,000 years, during which God has made circumstances perfect and beautiful, as far as the starting point perfect and beautiful, what happens is Satan is unbound, and we find out that, guess what? Even when all the circumstances surrounding us as humans are perfect and beautiful, we still mess it up. That's the human heart. The broken, fallen human heart will persist in doing wrong, in making bad choices. Someone said years ago when they were talking, I think it was Winston Churchill talking about a politician that was an enemy of his, and he said of him, he never loses an opportunity to lose an opportunity. And I think that there is a degree to which this is the case for human beings. That we still in so many cases attempt to go our own way. And so we read these words, and when the 1,000 years are ended, this time during which things have been made ideal and perfect and beautiful and Christ is reigning, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil, who had deceived them, was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So as we come to this section, whether your view of this is that we're talking about the end of the church age and the advancement of the gospel and the gospel will go forth. And we know that Christ promised, as he spoke to Peter, he said, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not withstand it. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. So those who come to this from an amillennial perspective look at this and say that this is the end of the church age. This is the end, and that in some sense Satan has been bound, and so the gospel has continued forward. So whether that is your position, or whether your position is, as you take a look at this, that this is the end of a period of time during which Jesus Christ has set up an earthly reign and has put into place the functions of a world that is built on it has just functions, it has righteousness prevailing over the course of it. Either way, what happens at the end of it is that Satan comes back, and as Satan comes back, people follow him still. People are still deceived. People are still convinced that they can do it themselves, that they can come up with a better world according to their own plan or Satan's plan, and that God is wrong. Even though they have experienced the best of privilege, the best of circumstances, the best of opportunity, they're still convinced that they can do it their own way. I was reminded of a song, actually, as I was thinking about this. How many of you know who Johnny Mitchell is? You know who Johnny Mitchell is? Famous Canadian singer. Okay, so Johnny Mitchell wrote a song called Woodstock. How many of you ever, you might not know the song Woodstock as sung by Johnny Mitchell. It's been covered by so many bands since then. Crosby, Stills, and Nash covered it. Dave Matthews covered it. A whole bunch of different people have covered it. But the thing is, in the song, she talks about walking down the road, meeting a child of God sort of thing, and they're heading to the farm where this music festival, Woodstock, is held. But the thing that comes out in it is that she talks about the fact that we're starlight, we're golden, and we have to get back to the garden. We have to get back to the garden. And you probably know what she's saying when she says we have to get back to the garden. She's saying we have to, in some way, find our way back to the paradise that is human perfection, that is everything wonderful as Eden was pictured to be. Now, the interesting thing is, I've always looked at those words and thought to myself, I know she's a full-on hippie, and I know what Woodstock was, and she portrays Woodstock as being a portion of, a piece of the garden. And if you know anything about it, it was basically a 3-day orgy in the mud sort of thing. She presents that as being what's wonderful, what's going to bring peace, and she talks about bombers turning into butterflies in the song and everything else. But it's an interesting thing when you go back and read it and then take a look at her own take on it, on the words of it. And her words of it was that basically what needed to happen was that we needed to discard our parents' outdated notions of sin. And if we just got rid of our parents' outdated notions of sin and what we were told was wrong and everything else, then we were going to end up in paradise. And that's a useful thing for you to understand when you think of the paradise that the 60s counterculture has produced over the last 60 years. Let's toss out our parents' understanding of what's right and wrong and what sin is, because when we do, we're going to get back to the garden. And this is what the release of Satan ultimately at the end of the millennium is about. You've been given every advantage. You have been given the good news in its fullness. You have been given that which God can bless you with so that you can understand that God's way is good. And still what happens? And still what happens? Humankind gathers together and says, we're going to do it our way. because our way is best. Our way is the way that's going to work. So we take a look, and at the end of the 1,000 years, we've reached the final stage of the old order. We've reached the final stage of life inside of history. Whether we're talking about the literal 1,000 years that a premillennial would say comes at the end of time as a final what would we call it? Time of revelation, time of revealing of the human heart, or whether it be that symbolic understanding of it as the church age and the expansion of the gospel expanding and making a difference in the world and making things so that there is a growing church, and so that there is more and more of good, even though there is bad in the mix. But Satan is released. And I want you to notice, he does not break out. Satan does not escape. He is released. And the point is that while he might defy God and he might attempt to usurp authority, it's still God who is sovereign and God who is in charge in all of this. And this is why we come back to one of our three themes from the book of Revelation. God is sovereign in the chaos of history. God is sovereign even as Satan tries to do his work for evil. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, Joseph says to his brothers. And the picture here is that what Satan attempts to do for evil, God is still using in order to accomplish good. And why does God decree or permit this? He does this to reveal the depth of sin in the human heart and the need for salvation and grace. And we continue the failure of Adam and Eve. And the people here continue the failure of Adam and Eve, even given every advantage that they had. I mean, there was a degree to which, if you take a look at the picture that's here as Satan is bound, there is a degree to which they were given something of the garden again. This vision is of people who are given something of the garden. And as they're given something of the garden, they do the same thing that Adam and Eve did. And I think we really have to understand out of this that as we consider the total depravity of the human heart goes back again and again, apart from the saving grace of God, to that which is destructive and that which is about autonomy and defiance and thinking, I can do better. And honestly, the crazy thing is, as we take a look at where we are, and there, I won't go into it in depth, but in a lot of ways, I think, as I hear some of the stuff that goes on in the broader culture, we're in bizarro world. The crazy thing is, here we are in bizarro world with everything of the we've got to get back to the garden mentality of the counterculture coming to full flower and doing all of its destruction. And as we see it doing all of its destruction, we have people saying, and we need more of the same to make it even better. This is the deception of the human heart. I look at what's happening to marriages. I look at what's happening to families. We mentioned the opioid crisis already. Remember, tune in, turn on, and drop out. That was the 60s. That was the 60s slogan as far as drug use was concerned. Tune in, turn on, and drop out. I mean, we take a look and we see all of this, and we see the opioid epidemic that's grown up out of this and everything else. And as we see all of this happening, what we have is we have legislators who say things like, well, you know what? If only we provide free drugs, it's going to make things better. And as my nephew says to me, he says, the crazy thing is, he says, I'm dealing with people now whose friends were involved, who themselves hadn't been involved, but said, well, if it's free and they're telling me it's good, maybe I should try it. So he says, we're getting first-time users because the supply is free. And you think this is the human heart. And uh, if the ship's going under because everybody is on this side of the ship, more humans run to that side and do dumber and dumber things. So again, Satan deceives the nations. And even those who have experienced God's blessing in the reign of Christ, who have experienced God's blessing in an earth that's in a better place than ever, will be deceived. So from the four corners of the earth come Gog and Magog. And when it says Gog and Magog, let's understand that there's symbolism here. It says they will come out, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth. The nations that are at the four corners of the earth. What does it mean when we talk about the four corners of the earth? We understand that the world is not a square. What's it mean? They're coming from everywhere. So this is the thing. This is all of humankind. This is humankind coming from every direction. And then it's called Gog and Magog. And that phrase harkens back to Ezekiel. In Ezekiel, this is an Old Testament phrase for those who oppose and oppress God's people. And if we take a look in the Old Testament, originally in Ezekiel, these terms, Gog and Magog, are used of people from the northeast of the Black Sea, probably Scythians, according to Josephus, who are kind of a proto-Russian ethnic group. Here, though, Gog and Magog are understood as coming from the four corners of the earth and being as the sands of the sea. So this is not pointing to one particular ethnic group. And again, this is where I find myself in between those who are premillennial, who try to say everything is literal, and those who are amillennial, who try to say for those who say that there is no restoration of national Israel. I find myself in between them because I look at it and I say, obviously there's symbolism in this. It's not talking about a specific geographical location and a specific ethnic group. It's talking symbolically, as it talks in Gog and Magog, of any who would stand in opposition to God, to God's purposes, to God's people, who would be looking to oppress God's people. And it says of them that this group, that they march up over the broad plain of the earth. And when it says they march up over the broad plain of the earth, this has been understood sometimes as they come from all over the earth, which would fit with the four corners idea. But from all over the earth, the people of God would be attacked. It says, and they surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. Wherever the church is, there is the camp of the saints. Wherever the church is, there is the beloved city. And some would say this means that they're being attacked everywhere. Well, this might be more specific than that. It might be that the people of God have located in and around Jerusalem, which is no longer Sodom and Egypt as it was early in Revelation. Remember, early on, Jerusalem is called Sodom and Egypt. Here, it's called the beloved city. And in this case, if it was actually when it says they marched up over the broad plain of the earth, if it was actually more geographically specific, earth might be more like the Hebrew understanding of eretz. Okay, the Hebrew word earth, eretz, is also translated land. In fact, if you were to take a look in Israel right now, from time to time, I read stuff from a Jewish newspaper called Haaretz, which means the land. And that's specifically the understanding of the land of promise that God has given. So when it says here, march up over the broad plain of the earth, John has Jewish background, and even though he's writing in Greek, he's someone whose understanding of the Greek word geo or geis would be similar to his Hebrew understanding of the word eretz, which can be either world as a whole or land specifically, the land of promise, God's land. So earth might be more like the Hebrew understanding of eretz, and camp, when it says here, they surrounded the camp of the saints. What do you think's going on with this word when it says they surrounded the camp of the saints? Is there anything that this reminds you of as you think biblically? Because again, as we read Revelation, we understand how much symbolic language there is that's deeply rooted in Old Testament thought, in a full Scripture understanding. What might be going on here with this word, the camp of the saints? Yes, Terry. Exactly. Yeah, this is probably what's being symbolized in this. And the camp harkens back to Israel's wilderness sojourn in hostile territory. Jerusalem is the symbol of God's presence with his people. The calling of it as the camp of the saints is the understanding that God's people living in the old order, living in a broken world, are always going to be living in hostile territory. And so the people of God, the camp of the saints, those who are in this broken world wilderness, are surrounded by those who would hate and oppress the people of God and who would oppose the purposes of God. The people of God among whom God lives, Jerusalem, would be surrounded by Gog and Magog. Either way, whether you understand this more in a geographical location terms, or whether you understand it as the church of God, wherever the church of God is in the earth, whichever way you understand it, in a final act of malevolence and evil, those under Satan's sway will attack the people of God. And in a final act of judgment, well, not final, but in an act of judgment, again, they will be met with swift and decisive destruction. So they surround the saints, the camp of the saints in the beloved city, but fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the dragon, like the false prophet, like the beast, is thrown into the lake of fire and into eternal punishment. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. And they will be tormented day and night forever. And so we see in this the final defeat of Satan. We see that what happens in this circumstance is that Satan has deceived the nations, that he has revealed again that even when circumstances are Edenic, the human heart will go its own way. Apart from the grace of God and the saving work of Jesus Christ, the human heart will head in its own direction. And the fact is, if you stop and think about it, even for we who are Christians, even if we have trusted Christ, we know the absolute importance of the fact that we are adopted by a God who holds on to us and that he has made us just. Because the fact is, even our hearts still are, as the hymn writer says, prone to wander. You think about that. As people who are saved, as people who have been blessed by the goodness of God, as people who have been adopted as sons and daughters, we still wander. And we still recognize the need to cling to the one who is holding on to us. Because, man, we head in directions that we absolutely know are in disobedience to the character and nature of God and his call on our life and his blessing. We do it. And we need to be called back again and again and again. And we need to be held on to. Yes, John. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, and I think that this is what we talk about in our. I think this is what we talk about in our understanding of the theological term that is kind of the what they would call the final link in the golden chain, the five links of salvation, and that's glorification. You know, in our glorification, what happens is God burns away all the dross, and as He burns away all the dross, then what happens is He takes and He holds us and He makes us so entirely His by His grace that we are transformed. You know, and that word glory, by the way, that's a pretty amazing word when you take a look at it in the Hebrew. And probably I'll end up touching on it a little bit more. But that word glory in the Hebrew is the word kavod, which means weighty or heavy. And I like the Hebrew understanding of weightiness or heaviness because it gives the idea of that which is most really real. And so in our glorification, then God takes away all the fiction, all the falsehood, all the stuff that is that we incline toward, and He makes us most really real, most entirely what we should be, and closest to being like Him, He who is ultimate reality. So. Yes, Daryl, sir. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Now, I mean, I don't know if this picture of fire would be related to the pillar of fire, but absolutely people who are under God's care and being guided by God, and that sojourner's idea is something that is a really, really important thing for us to understand. I mean, it goes all the way back to the whole idea of Abraham as a wandering Aramean, you know, so a sojourner, as someone who and we have this coming through very, very strongly that our citizenship is in heaven. We have an earthly citizenship, but our citizenship ultimately is in heaven. And so while we're here, there is a great degree to which we are people who are camping out, and as we're camping out, we desire to be people who are following Christ and keeping our eyes very firmly fixed. Hebrews does some interesting stuff with that, though, with the whole issue of the pillar of fire and following the pillar of fire. But I could go on, but if I do, probably it's going to get too long. So better stop at this point. But any other questions or thoughts or comments? Yes, John. Oh, you weren't here last week. So last week, what I explained was that ultimately, where I find myself is, I find myself seeing some degree of recapitulation and more symbolism in this more symbolism in the whole of the book than a lot of people who are premillennial. So I don't find myself tightly tied to this is chronology from chapter 4 through to chapter 19. I don't think it is, because I think there's recapitulation. But the other side of it is that where an amillennial view does not seem to recognize what Paul talks about in Romans 9 through 11 about the restoration of Israel, ethnic Israel, because it does talk about Israel being grafted back into the promises. I have to hold that. So it's like probably what happens is I would find myself looking and saying, you know, there's the reason that there's tension between the two sides, and there's a tension between the two sides because of the fact that both have aspects that are probably in some ways more faithful to Scripture. The other thing that I would say, though, is that when I take a look at it, what I could not say is that the church is kept from suffering, and this is the pre-tribulational side of premillennialism. I don't see a clear picture that the church is removed before all suffering. So probably you would call me a premillennial who is not pre-tribulational. So, okay. Well, let's pray. And if I've managed to get you bugged, then feel free to talk to me further about it. Okay. Father, thank you for allowing us to take time and to look through your truth. And as we look to your truth, we want to be people who are rooted and grounded in it. Help us to have a hunger to follow Jesus Christ first. And may we never simply be people who are curiosity seekers, but recognizing again and again that what you have given us for doctrine, reproof, correction, and instruction in righteousness, so that we may be made complete and thoroughly equipped for every good work. I pray, Lord, that the equipping that comes from your truth would cause us, even as we face struggles and difficulties, and even as hearts are prone to wander, cause us to cling to Christ. And may we keep our eyes fixed clearly on him. We thank you for the promise and the hope that we have of everlasting life through Jesus Christ. And may we live in the light of that hope. I pray this in Jesus' name.